Chosen ones, stop what you are doing. This message is a direct activation. That move you just made, the decision that's been weighing on you for months, the one you finally executed, it was not an accident. It was not a guess. It was a divinely orchestrated, military-grade spiritual operation. Right now, forces you cannot see are taking notes, and military analysts are scratching their heads, wondering who trained you. They thought you were panicking, that you were weak, that you were cornered. They were wrong. You didn't just react. You ran a spiritual Black Ops mission with a precision that has shaken the foundations of their entire plan. Welcome to God Connection. They thought it was luck. You know, it was a blueprint written in divine encryption. Most people move emotionally. They react, they rant, they rush. But you waited. You observed. You let every chaotic noise burn itself out before you struck with a precision so clean, it looked accidental. That's the kind of move they call a Black Ops moment. Silent, surgical, and unforgettable. While others were broadcasting their plans, you were building an algorithm of outcomes, reading human behavior like encrypted code. Studies from modern intelligence circles confirm that 80% of successful missions aren't about strength or weapons. They're about strategy and unpredictability. You somehow embodied both. Your decision wasn't just smart. It was strategic to the point of being spiritual. You played a move that would make Pentagon strategists nod in reluctant respect. There is something unnerving and slightly hilarious about how your enemies didn't even realize they were participants in your plan. They thought they were outsmarting you, not realizing you had already gamed out every variable 5 steps ahead. You didn't just flip the board, you redesigned the entire battlefield. So now, the world is watching. Some in awe, some in confusion, and others in deep regret, trying to figure out how you pulled it off. But they will never fully understand, because your last move wasn't born from impulse or intellect alone. It came from alignment. The moment your spirit and your strategy became one single, unstoppable frequency. This isn't coincidence. This is a military masterclass, spiritual edition. And tonight, we are about to dissect exactly how you did it. Number 1. You executed a pre-calculated silence. That single decision rewrote the entire game. While everyone else was rushing to respond, to defend their name, to clap back with emotional, low-frequency arguments, you did something terrifying to the untrained mind. You paused. You held your ground in complete, unnerving stillness. This wasn't out of weakness or fear. It was because you understood a profound spiritual law. Movement without meaning is just noise. You weren't frozen, you were focused. You were reading every subtle shift, every hidden motive, every psychological vibration in the air before making a single move. That is not just maturity, that is mastery. People around you, even those who claim to be on your side, mistook your silence for surrender. They couldn't recognize high-level strategy because it wasn't loud, messy, and desperate like theirs. They didn't realize that silence has layers, and you were playing 4D chess while they were still arguing over the rules of checkers. Every second you stayed quiet, they revealed more of themselves. Their insecurities got louder. Their false alliances exposed themselves. Their carefully constructed false confidence began to crack under the pressure of your stillness. You made them talk too much, and in their overexposure, they gave you every piece of intelligence you needed to win without firing a single shot. You turned your silence into a surveillance operation. That is what made your move a masterclass. While they were performing for an audience, you were observing for intel. You studied their tone, their timing, their tells, every habit, every inconsistency. You gathered intelligence the way elite tacticians do, quietly, patiently, deliberately. The more they tried to provoke you into a reaction, the more data you collected. You understood that reacting would waste your precious energy, but restraining your response would multiply it. So you waited, conserving your power until your words could cut with surgical precision instead of blunt emotional force. Your stillness became the trap they walked into willingly. They mistook your lack of response for a lack of awareness. They thought you were disconnected, but you were dissecting. They thought they were advancing, but you were allowing them to expose their entire blueprint. Then, when they least expected it, your silence ended with a single, perfectly timed action that undid months of their plotting. That's the difference between reacting and executing. Reacting comes from emotion. Executing comes from understanding. And your silence was the loudest, most profound understanding they had ever witnessed. You didn't just withhold words. You withheld access. You took control of the tempo, turned patience into power, and proved that restraint isn't weakness. It's high-level warfare disguised as calm. Number 2, you turned chaos into camouflage. While everyone else was desperately trying to look composed, predictable, and in control, you allowed life's confusion to become your disguise. You didn't fight the storm, you blended with it. You became the storm. That's what made your strategy so genius. You understood something most people never learn. When everything looks chaotic, no one can trace your real intentions. You became unreadable, and that is the hardest position to attack. When people expected you to panic, you stayed unbothered. When they expected you to collapse under the pressure, you adjusted your stance. You didn't waste a single breath of energy trying to explain your process to people who couldn't even grasp your perspective. You let things appear messy to the outside world because you knew that within that mess was a hidden, divine order. Every unexpected turn, every unpredictable moment, every door that slammed shut became another layer of protection around your true purpose. While they were trying to calculate your next move, they couldn't even figure out which direction you were facing. That's what chaos does for a wise person. It conceals their growth until it is too late for anyone to stop it. Your life started moving in ways that made no sense to onlookers, and that was the beauty of it. Confusion became your cover. People wrote you off, thinking you'd lost your mind or lost control, but you had never been more strategic. You were letting uncertainty mislead your observers while you were busy building something too intricate for their limited minds to comprehend. The more unpredictable your journey looked, the more secure your mission became. No one attacks what they cannot define. You made yourself unclassifiable. You were too calm for the critics, too complex for the copycats. What's truly remarkable is that you didn't resist the disorder, you redirected it. You learned how to turn what was meant to distract you and throw you off course into a defensive shield. That is a level of awareness that goes far beyond intellect. That is intuition infused with divine discipline. You stopped chasing the illusion of control and started using unpredictability as your greatest advantage. While others were trying to manage every tiny variable, you learned to move with fluidity, adapting faster than they could possibly react. By turning chaos into camouflage, you mastered the art of invisibility in plain sight. You stopped needing to prove your stability because your purpose didn't require a performance, it required precision. That's how you outmaneuvered them. You didn't hide by running. You hid by being everywhere and nowhere all at the same time. Number 3, you stopped playing the game and started studying the players. That is the moment everything shifted in your favor. Most people get trapped on the surface. They focus on winning the immediate rounds, the petty arguments, or the temporary attention. But you went deeper. You went tactical. You stopped obsessing over the immediate outcomes and started observing the patterns of human behavior. You realized that every single person moves according to their internal programming. And if you can decode that programming, you can predict their next move before they even think of it. That is not manipulation, that is mastery. You stopped getting emotional about people's actions and started analyzing their patterns. You became a profiler of fallen spirits. You noticed that ego always reveals itself in repetition. The way someone celebrates, the way they lie, the way they compete, the way they flatter, it's all data. You learned that people rarely, if ever, change. They just hide their motives better as they get older. So while others were distracted by the performance, you were in the audience collecting information. You became a silent observer, not to judge, but to understand. That critical shift gave you a power that most people never develop. The power to stay 5 steps ahead without saying a single word. Every betrayal became a case study. Every argument became research. Every relationship, whether good or bad, became a masterclass in psychology. You stopped being shocked by people's behavior because you began to see the patterns, the source code, behind it. You started recognizing when their words didn't match their energy, when their kindness was laced with a hook of control, and when their confidence was just fear wearing an expensive perfume. That's how you stopped getting blindsided. You started reading people for who they were, not for who they pretended to be or who you hoped they could be. The real turning point came when you stopped taking anything personally. Once you detached emotionally, you saw their actions as predictable scripts rather than random, personal attacks. You realized that human behavior runs on habit, and habit always leaves a trail. That awareness turned your life into a strategy board where you were no longer a pawn reacting to their moves, but the grandmaster orchestrating the entire outcome. You didn't need to expose anyone. Their patterns did it for you. You just stopped giving them roles in your story. That's why your last move looked so flawless. It wasn't spontaneous. It was calculated for months, maybe even years, of silent observation. You weren't just in the game. You had mastered the psychology of everyone playing it. And by understanding the players, you stopped needing to prove anything. You simply moved with precision, letting your divine awareness lead where raw emotion once did. Number 4, you weaponized restraint. This was your breakthrough. In a time where everyone rushes to defend their honor, to prove their point, to respond to every allegation, you did something that rattled your opponents more than any counterattack ever could. You didn't move. You didn't explain. You didn't justify. You let the noise, the gossip, and the accusations burn themselves out while you conserved every single ounce of your energy for the one move that would actually count. That level of discipline is terrifyingly rare because it demands a complete ego death. You had to be willing to let people believe what they wanted to believe, even when you had the receipts and could have easily corrected them. But that restraint gave you something they didn't have: complete control over the battlefield. You understood that a reaction is free information for your enemies. Every time you show frustration, they learn your triggers. Every time you rush to defend yourself, they map your insecurities. So you stopped giving them data. You starved them of access. And that silence became unnerving to them. When you didn't respond to their provocations, they started guessing. When you didn't take their bait, they started doubting their own strategy. That is the supreme beauty of restraint. It turns the aggressor inward. They start fighting their own paranoia and shadowboxing with the image of you they created in their head, while you quietly regain your advantage. Every person who underestimated your quietness didn't realize you were in full intelligence-gathering mode. You watched them exhaust themselves. You watched them expose their loyalties and reveal their desperation. You turned their impatience into a confession. The more they tried to provoke you, the more they uncovered themselves. And while they mistook your stillness for weakness, you were timing your move with surgical precision. When you finally acted, it wasn't out of a burst of emotion. It was out of a place of deep, calculated strategy. One action, one statement, one shift, and everything they had built collapsed under its own instability. That is what restraint really is. It is not suppression, it is strategy. It's the art of conserving energy until it becomes an unstoppable, focused force. You didn't lose momentum by pausing, you gained clarity. You learned that you don't need to move every time something shakes you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay completely still, long enough to see who reveals themselves when you do nothing. You mastered the kind of patience that terrifies manipulators, the kind that studies instead of reacts. You turned waiting into warfare and your silence into a sword. That is not weakness. That is genius in slow motion. Number 5, you let them think they won the skirmish. This was, perhaps, the most brilliant psychological trap of all. You understood that the fastest way to expose and dismantle arrogance is to feed it. So you did the unthinkable. You stepped back. You let them throw their punches. You let them take their little victories and parade around as if they had conquered something significant. You didn't interrupt their performance. You knew the power of illusion, and you let them believe their own. Because when ego takes the stage, it always performs past its own limit. You didn't lose the battle. You set it up so the war would win itself. Ego is the enemy's blindfold. Once someone truly believes they have outsmarted you, they stop evolving. They get sloppy. They stop watching their back because they think the story is over. That's exactly where you had them. Your loss was not a failure. It was an invisibility cloak. By stepping aside, you moved from being a target to being a ghost in their system. They relaxed their defenses. They bragged too loudly. And in that noise, they exposed every weakness, every insecurity, and every hidden agenda you needed to see. Every time they laughed at your so-called defeat, you were listening. Every time they bragged about your downfall, you were noting who clapped the loudest. You studied every new alliance, every fake smile, every subtle shift in energy. What they didn't realize was that you were still on the field. You had just changed terrain. You weren't hiding out of fear. You were gathering information. You were refining your strategy. You were sharpening your patience. You didn't bow out. You were building up. The moment they thought they had buried you, you were already rewriting the entire map of the battlefield. When you finally moved again, it was with a precision they could not anticipate because they thought you were already dead. You didn't need revenge. You had revelation. You let them exhaust themselves chasing shadows while you prepared the quiet storm that would end their illusion permanently. That's why, when you finally acted, it wasn't loud or messy. It was clean and decisive. You let them believe they had won because you understood the higher truth. Only those blinded by ego confuse a temporary victory with permanent closure. You gave them the illusion of triumph so you could own the reality of power. And when the dust settled, they realized far too late that they hadn't won anything. They had just walked straight into the lesson you built for them. Number 6. You used exposure as a booby trap. This was the move that flipped the entire power dynamic. Most people guard every detail of their lives, thinking that secrecy equals safety. But you understood something far more sophisticated. Information control isn't just about hiding. It's about selective visibility. You learned to weaponize transparency. You showed them exactly what you wanted them to see, not what was actually happening. You gave them a version of you that was slightly cracked, slightly uncertain, and slightly unguarded, just enough to trigger their instinct to pounce. And when they did, you had them exactly where you wanted them. You knew that pride and arrogance always walk straight into the light, thinking it's a spotlight for their victory. So you became the light. You presented the illusion of vulnerability, knowing it would attract those with hidden motives like moths to a flame. You let them think they had inside access to your weaknesses, but you were really just mapping their intentions. Every question they asked, every piece of advice they gave, every reaction they had, revealed what they wanted most: control. What they didn't know was that their curiosity was being tracked, cataloged, and studied. You weren't just being observed. You were observing the observers. That is the brilliance of your method. You flipped the psychology of exposure. While they were convinced you had slipped up and shared too much, you were actually testing loyalty. You were measuring who would use what you revealed to help you and who would use it to harm you. The moment they moved wrong, you didn't need a confrontation. Their actions exposed them louder than any words ever could. You didn't need to trap them physically. They trapped themselves by acting on false or incomplete information that you fed them. Every piece of truth you let slip was a setup for discernment. You created a stage where intentions could not hide. You made people show their cards by giving them a fake deck. That is high-level intelligence, to let someone believe they have gained the upper hand, only for them to realize they were never even in the real game at all. You turned exposure into execution. What looked like recklessness was actually precision. You weren't leaking weakness, you were filtering energy. You understood that control isn't about being unseen. It's about being unpredictably transparent. By mastering what you revealed and when, you made curiosity your weapon and their deceit their undoing. Number 7. You mastered the art of energy redistribution. This changed everything. You stopped letting your emotions drain you and started using them as fuel. Where most people explode, implode, or crumble under pressure, you learned to absorb the impact, process it, and turn it into propulsion. Every disappointment, every insult, every attack, every moment that was designed to break you, you recycled it. You learned how to convert emotional heat into forward motion. That is not just strength, that is spiritual evolution. You stopped leaking energy and started investing it. Anger stopped being something that consumed you and became something that informed you. Instead of reacting out of blind rage, you began responding with cold, hard reason. You turned that emotional turbulence into tactical awareness, studying what triggered you and why. That's how you grew sharper. You realized that anger is just energy looking for a direction, and if you give it a divine purpose, it becomes an unstoppable force for change. Pain stopped being a punishment and became a tool. It made you observe patterns. It refined your judgment. It forced you to trust your instincts above all else. You no longer wasted time fighting battles that didn't build you. Every strike against you became an upgrade to your discernment. Rejection stopped hurting the way it used to because you finally saw it for what it really was: redirection. Every time a door closed in your face, it taught you how to build your own. Every time someone counted you out, it clarified who was never meant to count in your circle. You used rejection like reconnaissance, gathering intel about what environments, people, and frequencies did not deserve your energy. Instead of letting bitterness grow roots, you used it as compost for your next level. What's extraordinary is how natural your transformation became. You no longer needed external validation to feel powerful because you discovered internal circulation, the ability to generate your own strength from within. Where others wasted emotional ammunition on proving themselves in pointless arguments, you used yours to refine your purpose. Every wound, instead of leaving you weaker, left you wiser. You turned emotional breakdowns into spiritual data points. That is what no military or system can replicate: the ability to take invisible pain and translate it into visible, undeniable progress. You became your own power plant. Every emotion that once destabilized you now fuels you. That is mastery in motion. Not avoiding emotion, but redirecting it until every loss becomes an asset and every scar becomes a part of your strategy. This is a deep dive, anointed one, and you are here because this message is for you. If this divine intelligence is resonating with your spirit, take a second to subscribe to God Connection. You are not alone in this war. You are part of an army of light, and your subscription strengthens our network. And if this ministry is feeding your soul, and you feel called to support the mission, please consider using this super thanks button below this video. A $10 donation is a powerful seed sown into this work, helping us reach more chosen ones who are waking up and arming them with this truth. We are grateful for every act of support. Now, let's get back to the blueprint. Number 8. You made predictability impossible. This was your greatest power move. You stopped moving in straight, predictable lines, the kind that people can study, anticipate, or mirror. One day you were calm, patient, and calculating, and the next you were an unstoppable, untraceable force of nature. You became fluid. You never stayed in one version of yourself long enough for anyone to define you, box you in, or plot against you. That's what threw everyone off balance. They couldn't prepare for you because you kept rewriting your own algorithm. Every time they thought they had you figured out, you shifted frequencies. You became a living paradox, structured yet spontaneous, peaceful yet powerful, quiet yet commanding. You stopped living in patterns because you understood that patterns are prisons for the predictable. Most people are easy to control because they are painfully consistent in their habits, their reactions, and their weaknesses. But you evolved beyond that. You learned to move according to alignment, not routine. Your steps became guided by divine insight, not by human impulse. You weren't just rebelling. You were adapting, moving faster than their analysis could ever track. When they thought you were retreating, you were regenerating. When they thought you were done, you were transforming. That kind of unpredictability isn't chaos. It's higher intelligence at work. You blurred the line between strategy and spirituality. You didn't just make smart moves, you made divine ones. You started listening to the frequency of energy more than the noise of opinions. You stopped explaining your process and started trusting your intuition to lead the way, even when it made no logical sense. That's why no one could decode you, because you weren't operating on 3D logic anymore. You were moving on vibration. You mastered the delicate balance between instinct and intellect, and that is a combination no system knows how to measure or defend against. Your unpredictability made control impossible. People who once studied you like a formula got lost when the equation stopped working. They kept trying to find the old version of you, not realizing that version had already evolved into another frequency. You became a living shift, not just changing your mind, but changing your entire mode of existence whenever the moment demanded it. That is why your last move can't be traced. You transcended the need to be understood. You stopped being a player in their system and became the variable that breaks it. You didn't just move differently, you moved beyond their definition. Number 9, you turned disadvantage into data. This was the turning point where loss stopped meaning defeat. Every time you were outnumbered, dismissed, misunderstood, or pushed into a corner, you didn't crumble. You studied. You treated every single setback like a surveillance mission. When they talked over you, you listened harder. When they tried to block your path, you watched their coordination. You learned the rhythm of their arrogance, the tone of their lies, and the hidden cracks in their alliances. While they thought they were overpowering you, they were actually exposing themselves. And you were recording everything. You understood something that few people ever grasp. Losing isn't failure if you are learning while it happens. You began to see how much critical information hides in disadvantage. When your resources were scarce, you learned innovation. When you had no allies, you learned independence. When people underestimated you, you learned the power of invisibility. Every disadvantage refined your adaptability. You started gathering data on how people operate when they think you can't fight back. And that is where their true nature showed. That is when the masks slip, hierarchies crumble, and power becomes sloppy. You didn't interrupt it, you observed it. Those moments taught you how to think like both the hunter and the hunted. You saw patterns others missed because you experienced them from the bottom up. You watched who broke under pressure, who betrayed under fear, and who pretended to help while secretly competing. That gave you something priceless, insight. You didn't need to dominate the moment because you were busy mastering the map. By the time others celebrated their small, petty victories, you already knew how to dismantle their entire strategy. You turned every mistake, every rejection, and every obstacle into a field report. You learned to analyze your own emotions as well. How frustration signals a need for redirection. How exhaustion reveals where your energy is leaking. How silence gathers clarity. You weren't being punished, you were being trained in data-driven discernment. By treating every disadvantage as information instead of humiliation, you positioned yourself beyond emotion and into evolution. You became a walking archive of lessons your enemies never meant to teach you. And that's why your comeback felt like prophecy, not coincidence. Because your victories weren't improvised. They were built on everything you once endured and decoded. Number 10. You disguised divine timing as human hesitation. This is why your steps looked so confusing to those watching from the outside. They mistook your pauses for procrastination. They mistook your stillness for indecision, not realizing you were following precise instructions from a higher command center. While they mocked your stillness and labeled you stuck, you were aligning your movement with a timing so perfect, it could only have been divinely engineered. You understood that rushing is a form of fear, and you refused to let fear dictate your direction. You didn't delay out of doubt. You delayed because you sensed heaven was synchronizing something far larger than your own perspective could see. Every time it looked like you had missed an opportunity, it was actually being recalibrated by the universe to fit you better. When doors shut, it wasn't rejection, it was a divine reroute. You weren't being left behind. You were being held back until the environment matched your vibration. That's what divine timing really is, spiritual geometry. Every angle, every intersection, every delay fits into a design so intricate, it makes chaos look planned. You were moving in rhythm with a force that doesn't rush, because what is eternal never hurries. Your enemies read your patience as hesitation, but they didn't know that hesitation can be holy. You weren't frozen, you were filtering. You were checking the spiritual weather, sensing when the atmosphere was favorable for a breakthrough and when it was not. While they were forcing outcomes through brute will, you were waiting for clearance. And when your moment finally came, it wasn't random. It was synchronized. Everything that once felt delayed suddenly made perfect, crystal clear sense. That is what separates divine strategy from human ambition. Ambition moves by impulse. Strategy moves by instruction. You weren't guessing your way forward, you were being guided. You trusted that what seems too late in human time is often right on cue in divine order. You mastered the discipline of stillness in a world that worships speed. So when you finally made your move, it hit with precision, not panic. It looked effortless, but only because it was executed at the exact second destiny opened the gate. You didn't need to chase timing. You became aligned with it. You moved when heaven said move. And that's why your so-called delay became the doorway to everything they thought you had missed. Number 11. You turned every betrayal into a blueprint. This is what made you unstoppable. Most people crumble when trust collapses, but you turned treachery into training. Every betrayal that was meant to break you, every backstab that was meant to end you, ended up becoming your manual for mastery. You began to see the patterns in deception. Who betrays, when they betray, and why they betray. You realized betrayal wasn't random. It was a strategic exposure, orchestrated by the divine to show you a flaw in your system. It revealed how loyalty operates under pressure and how masks melt under the heat of truth. You stopped taking betrayal personally and started studying it like an architect studies a building structure, not for emotion, but for design. Each backstab became a compass, pointing you directly toward what needed reinforcement. Every person who turned on you taught you something profound about the architecture of manipulation. You learned where the cracks in your own trust system were, where your empathy needed boundaries, and where your heart needed armor. They thought they were teaching you pain, but they were actually teaching you precision. You started recognizing how liars move, how pretenders speak, and how hidden enemies disguise themselves as your biggest supporters. You stopped being naive, not because you grew colder, but because you became infinitely wiser. By the time they noticed you were no longer the same target they first attacked, you had already mapped their psychology. You could sense betrayal before it even happened, and rather than panic, you took notes. You studied the rhythm of deception so well that you could read silence, energy shifts, and even subtle changes in tone as advanced warning signals. What they thought was chaos was really your classroom. You didn't just go through betrayal, you extracted intelligence from it. So when new battles arose, you weren't walking in blind faith anymore. You were walking with decoded, battlefield-tested insight. You didn't need to guess people's loyalty. You could see it in their consistency or lack thereof. Every knife they used against you became a pen in your hand, writing the manual they didn't know they were helping you build. You mastered your emotions, sharpened your discernment, and became impossible to ambush. You turned betrayal into a blueprint, and that is why what once wounded you now works for you. You didn't just survive deception, you engineered wisdom from it. They trained you through their treachery, and now you command the very battlefield they thought would destroy you. Number 12. You waged a war of frequency, not flesh. This changed everything. You stopped meeting people at the level of their chaos and started operating at the altitude of your clarity. You learned that some battles aren't meant to be fought head-on. They are meant to be out-vibrated. Instead of swinging back, you started soaring higher. You discovered that peace wasn't a passive weakness. It was an active weapon that disarmed confusion. While your enemies schemed in the realm of noise, gossip, and drama, you shifted into the realm of resonance, where only truth can breathe. You understood that energy doesn't lie. Every intention, every thought, every word carries a vibration. And once you elevated yours, you became vibrationally untouchable. They couldn't track you anymore because they were tuned to a lower, denser frequency. The insults bounced off. The manipulation lost its access. The spiritual warfare that used to drain, you couldn't even locate your new address. You stopped reacting, and in that divine stillness, your power multiplied. What they mistook for indifference was actually spiritual superiority. Not an ego-driven superiority, but an evolutionary one. While they used gossip as their ammunition, you used silence as your strategy. While they fought to be seen, you fought to stay aligned. You realized that true power doesn't scream, it radiates. And every time you chose calm over chaos, your vibration shifted the entire battlefield. Suddenly, their plans began collapsing without you lifting a finger, because frequency governs form. And when your energy rose above theirs, reality itself had to follow your command. You began to understand that warfare isn't about who shouts the loudest, but who can sustain the highest vibration the longest. You stopped defending yourself in the flesh because you understood that flesh can be framed, but frequency cannot. They could lie about your character, but they could not fake your energy. You started winning battles without confrontation, without revenge, and without retaliation. You simply stayed in alignment, and that alignment did all the heavy lifting. That is the kind of warfare generals can't study because it's not in any manual. You didn't conquer through control, you conquered through collaboration with the divine. You changed your energy, and the war changed its rules. And that's when you realized you didn't just escape the battle, you transcended it. Because altitude will always beat attitude every single time. Number 13. You turned their surveillance into your stage. This was your quietest, most powerful rebellion. They thought monitoring you, watching your every move, and gossiping about your life would make them masters of your movement. But it only made them confused spectators of their own confusion. You realized early on that when people watch you with the intent to control, they stop seeing truth. They only see what threatens them or what they want to see. So you gave them something to look at. You turned their scrutiny into a spectacle. Every step, every silence, every shift became an unpredictable performance that kept their data incomplete and their analysis permanently off balance. You understood that being watched wasn't always a curse. Sometimes it was camouflage. They thought they were collecting intel on you. In reality, you were collecting insight on them. You studied how they studied you. Their reactions revealed their insecurities. Their silence revealed their intentions. And while they tried to dissect your life like a mission report, you turned their every observation into misdirection. You let them think they were seeing everything, when in reality, they were only watching what you allowed them to see. You became the illusionist in your own story, letting them chase shadows while you were building real substance in the dark. They thought they had you cornered because they could predict your next move based on your past. But that's where you outclassed them. You stopped moving in patterns. You started moving in purpose. Their cameras, their prying eyes, and their gossip channels couldn't keep up because you were evolving in dimensions they didn't even believe existed. What they documented was outdated by the time they recorded it. And that is the beauty of it. They thought their surveillance would limit you, but it only magnified your mystery. You learned how to perform under pressure without losing your authenticity. You learned how to shine without revealing your strategy. You let them waste hours of their own precious time decoding your every step, while you used that same attention as fuel for your ascension. They were busy taking notes. You were busy taking ground. By the time they realized you had turned their observation into your advantage, it was far too late. Their surveillance became your spotlight. Their obsession became your advertisement. And their confusion became your cover. You turned their control tactic into a classroom on unpredictability. They are still trying to analyze your moves, not knowing the real performance was never your actions. It was your revolution. Number 14. You didn't win with power. You won with precision. This is what separates warriors from legends. You weren't trying to overpower anyone. You were studying the rhythm beneath the chaos. You knew that while most people fight to be seen, the real victors fight to understand. You learned the architecture of conflict, the pressure points, the timing, the triggers, and you struck not with rage, but with refined, spiritual awareness. Your final move wasn't explosive, it was exact. It didn't need to be loud, because true precision doesn't announce itself. It simply executes with elegance. You discovered that brute force is for those who lack insight. Anyone can throw a punch, but few can place it where it matters. You realized that noise wins moments, but accuracy wins wars. While they bragged about their strength, you quietly refined your aim. You stopped reacting emotionally and started responding intelligently. You studied not just their actions, but their patterns, the repetition of their ego, the predictability of their pride, the laziness of those who think they are untouchable. You didn't have to overpower them. You simply had to outthink them. Every delay, every betrayal, Every attempt to corner you became part of your calibration process. You learned how to move with minimal effort but maximum effect. When you finally made your move, it looked effortless to the outside world, but only because your precision was perfected in absolute silence. You hit the exact weak spot in their structure, the one they didn't even know existed. And when their system collapsed, everyone thought it was sudden. But it wasn't. It was surgical timing. It was strategic restraint. It was divine geometry in motion. Your victory didn't come from domination. It came from discipline. You didn't crush your enemies. You made them collapse under the weight of their own miscalculations. You didn't need to scream your power. You demonstrated it through your accuracy. You won not by overpowering the opposition, but by mastering yourself. That is what makes your triumph so unsettling to them. It wasn't fueled by ego. It was fueled by evolution. You didn't just win the battle. You rewrote how the war is fought. Your win is now a blueprint, a quiet warning to every system that mistook your calm for weakness. Because in a world obsessed with power plays, you proved that precision, spiritual, mental, and emotional, is the highest and most lethal form of dominance. The legacy of your move. At this point, it is clear. Your last move wasn't luck. It was legacy. You didn't stumble into brilliance. You engineered it with divine intelligence, spiritual discipline, and relentless awareness. Every step you took was a calculated echo of something higher, guiding your path. You weren't just moving pieces on a board. You were rewriting the laws of strategy itself. Every pause, every setback, every silence had a reason. Every delay was divine design. What looked like waiting was weaponizing. What looked like defeat was data collection. What looked like isolation was initiation. You became the kind of force no army can train for and no algorithm can predict. Your warfare wasn't carnal, it was cosmic. You fought not with fists, but with frequencies. You learned that true power doesn't shout, it signals. You didn't just play the game, you changed its dimensions. You taught everyone watching that mastery isn't about movement, it's about meaning. You didn't crush enemies, you outgrew them. You didn't retaliate, you recalibrated. You didn't win by overpowering, you won by out-evolving.